Hey guys, tonight we're gliding back to the golden haze of myth, into a tale that's less thunderbolts and more passive-aggressive divine pettiness. You find yourself drifting through thick, honey-coloured air, high above the clouds of ancient Greece. Olympus looms nearby, its marble halls glittering faintly in the dusk. The gods are supposed to be immortal and all-powerful, but honestly, most of them are just tired. Tired of each other, tired of drama, and especially tired of Zeus pretending he's subtle. You float gently over a table of ambrosia crusts and overturned goblets. Someone's left a half-eaten olive loaf next to an open amphora. You hear faint arguing, Hera's voice, sharp and rhythmic, like a temple bell, followed by Zeus muttering something about just being friendly. The air smells of crushed laurel, singed sandalwood, and poor decisions. And here's the thing, you're about to sit through a myth so packed with regrettable moments you might actually stay awake from second-hand embarrassment. But let's be real, you won't survive this fully conscious. The pacing is gentle, the stakes are low, and at least one main character spends a third of the story mooing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start by trundling through a patch of celestial garden that Zeus insists is for meditation, but everyone knows he mostly uses it for stalking pretty mortals from above. Gods like to meddle, and no one meddles with more flair than Zeus. Below, on the mortal plane, a small nymph named Io dips her fingers into a stream. She's not singing or summoning anything. She's not even in a dramatic pose. She just wants to enjoy a few minutes of not being bothered by either deities or goats. But naturally, that's too much to ask. You see, in the ancient Greek ecosystem, beauty isn't just admired, it's a curse. If you're pretty and near a river, you are basically a walking catastrophe magnet. And poor Io is glowing, her eyes are soft, her sandals are unscuffed, her aura is practically a Greek tragedy waiting to bloom. Zeus notices. Now here's where the myth gets murky. Historians still argue whether Io was actually a priestess of Hera at the time, which would make everything Zeus is about to do not just awkward but cosmically idiotic. One version of the tale suggests Io was already semi-sacred to Hera, making what follows a celestial-level betrayal. But Zeus is Zeus. He sends clouds, thick ones, pillow-like and suspiciously localized. You've seen cartoon villains hide behind trees. This is the divine equivalent, only with cumulonimbus. Somewhere in that magical fog bank, Zeus introduces himself with his usual subtlety.
And Io, she reacts like most people would. If a thunder deity materialized midstream, she panics, probably mumbles something about needing to be anywhere else. But Zeus is relentless and charming, like a wet Labrador who also commands lightning. This is the moment you realize how oddly quiet Olympus has gone. Hera knows. Of course she does. She always does. Back in the celestial garden, the temperature drops by a few degrees. You hear the rhythmic clicking of Hera's heels. Yes, she's the only god who wears them just for the effect. She appears at the edge of the scene, half-shadowed, with one eyebrow raised and the vague scent of pomegranates trailing behind her. There's a pause. Then suddenly Io, blinking, terrified mid-excuse, is a cow. A literal cow, smooth white fur, large damp eyes, tail twitching nervously. And if cows could scream, Io would be.
But instead, she stands frozen, hooves in the mud, ears flicking as she processes the ungodly speed of her own transformation. Here's the kicker. No one admits anything. Zeus shrugs, Hera smirks, the cow stares. From a distance, this scene would look almost pastoral, but you're close enough to hear the tension humming like a lyre string. And it's here, right in this moment, you see the real power of Hera. She doesn't explode, she doesn't curse. She simply smiles and says, "What a lovely animal, husband." Zeus nods too quickly. Just found her. roaming. And before anyone can interrupt, Hera adds, "I think I'll keep her." You don't remember agreeing to this, but you're now gently ambling alongside a cow, a very confused cow. Her eyes blink slowly, her breath comes out in long, foggy huffs, and her tail keeps flicking like it hasn't quite accepted its own existence. This cow, of course, is Io, the same nymph who, barely 10 minutes ago, had a functioning vocabulary and ambitions that didn't involve chewing cud. She's walking under the watchful eye of Hera now, tethered not with rope, but with something far heavier, suspicion. Hera names her new pet, Sweet One, which is code for, "I know exactly who you are and I'm going to make you regret being born pretty." You, meanwhile, drift behind them as Hera takes Io on what can only be described as the slowest and most passive-aggressive stroll in mythological history. Hera isn't walking the cow. No, she's parading her. Through gardens, past altars, in full view of literally every gossip-prone deity on Olympus. It's important to note that Io, despite her hooves and the involuntary cud-chewing, is still very much aware of everything. That's the worst part. She can't speak, but she remembers. She flinches at thunder. She glares at Zeus whenever he's dumb enough to peek through a cloud. And Hera leans in real close one morning and whispers, "I hope you like grass, darling. You'll be eating it for a long, long time." This is how you end up witnessing the only myth in the Greek canon that doubles as both a love triangle and an unauthorized livestock adoption. But backtrack for a moment. Let's remember who Io was before this four-legged drama began. She wasn't famous. That came later. She wasn't heroic or tragic or even particularly ambitious. Io was a local river nymph, daughter of Inachus, one of those minor river gods who spent more time maintaining water flow than attending celestial meetings. Her life revolved around morning mist, fish chatter, and avoiding centaurs, which, let's be honest, was probably a full-time job. Yet somehow she caught the eye of Zeus, like dozens before her and dozens after. What made her different wasn't beauty, it was timing. Wrong place, wrong century, wrong king of gods. And once Hera decided to adopt her, things took a turn toward the theatrical. Because here's a fringe tidbit. Ancient poets loved to debate whether Hera actually believed Io was just a cow. Some claim she knew the truth instantly and decided to play a very, very long game. Others suggest Hera was testing Zeus, waiting to see if he'd flinch, fess up, or send Hermes in for a rescue attempt too soon. Historians still argue whether Hera's motives were jealousy, divine justice, or just sheer boredom, maybe all three. But the result remains the same. Io's days of sipping river dew and braiding moss are officially over. She's now spending her hours nervously circling a sacred olive grove, monitored by celestial birds and very judgmental dryads. And let's talk about the dryads for a second. Tree spirits are notoriously nosy. They don't speak much, but you can hear them rustle pointedly whenever Io passes. They lean a little too close. Their leaves twitch in syncopated rhythms of disapproval. One even drops an acorn deliberately on Io's back. You'd think someone who was turned into a cow would be spared the mean girl treatment, but alas, mythology doesn't work like that. Meanwhile, Zeus sulks. He doesn't dare confront Hera directly. There's nothing less intimidating than a sky god who can't admit he's been caught. Instead, he just lingers in the background, sends fog, causes small, localized rainstorms. At one point, he tries to communicate with Io by arranging clouds into vaguely bovine shapes. It's not successful or helpful. And it's not just Io who's fed up. You start to notice that even the lesser gods are keeping their distance. No one wants to get caught in the middle of this drama. Not when the last guy who tried to help got turned into a weeping willow for sympathizing too loudly. The days pass, maybe weeks. Time in myth is slippery like that. You fall into the same rhythm Io does, grazing, pacing, dodging divine glances. You grow used to her snorts, the sad weight of her eyes, the way she still tries to sit like a human sometimes before remembering her legs don't bend that way anymore. And then, just when Io's starting to think maybe this is her new normal, Hera escalates, she assigns a guardian, not just any guardian, Argus Panoptes, the many-eyed monster, the celestial insomniac, the being whose entire job is to make sure no one ever escapes unnoticed. We'll get to him next, but for now, you simply observe as Hera watches Io chew grass in silence and smiles to herself with the calm satisfaction of a woman who has just installed 24-hour surveillance on her enemy and named it Justice. The breeze shifts, and you hear it before you see him, the rhythmic squelch of heavy sandals across wet earth. There's no mistaking the arrival of Argus Panoptes, not because he's loud or dramatic or even particularly large. No, it's the sound, like a hallway full of sleepy security cameras all adjusting at once. Argus doesn't just have eyes in the back of his head. He has eyes on his knees, on his shoulders, on his elbows. There's one nestled under each fingernail and another blinking lazily on the knuckle of his left pinky. They don't all open at once, thank the gods. He's not a chandelier. But enough are awake at any given moment to give off the general vibe that you and Io and the very air around you are being watched. He lumbers over to the cow, doesn't say much, just nods. One of the eyes on his ankle winks. Io flinches. You watch Hera explain the task in that sing-song voice reserved for divine vengeance cloaked in civility. Just keep her safe, she says. Make sure she doesn't wander, or transform, or get abducted by anyone with a beard and a lightning bolt. Argus bows. Several of his eyes close at once in what could generously be called a salute. And thus begins the weirdest phase of Io's captivity, supervised grazing. You trail them through sun-drenched meadows and ancient fig orchards where the leaves hum like cicadas and the cows moo with a kind of existential dread. Io walks in loops. Argus follows. Occasionally, he tries to engage, says things like, "I used to be a river spirit once too, you know," or, "Don't feel bad, lots of people get turned into cows. It doesn't help." Now here's your mainstream historical fact for the section. In classical Greek art, Argus was often depicted with exactly 100 eyes. 100. And artists had a field day with this. Some sculptures gave him peacock-style eye clusters across his torso. Others just dotted his body like a divine game of connect the dots. But in early literature, he wasn't just a freak show, he was useful. He could see things even when he was asleep, because only half his eyes ever rested at once. That made him the perfect spy, bodyguard, and sleep-deprived nightmare. And poor Io now has that trailing her every moo. You settle into the rhythm, hoof-step, eye blink, hoof-step, watchful sigh. Argus never rests. Even when he sits under a cedar tree, a few of his eyes stay alert, glinting in the shade like bored sapphires. He hums to himself, off-key. You realize with a slight chill that he hums constantly. One day, during a particularly dull walk near a barley field, Io bolts. No warning, just turns on her hooves and sprints, grass flying, birds scattering, mooing, frantic, and echoing across the hills. Argus is up in an instant, not running, just blinking. His eyes form a kind of optical fence, tracking Io in lazy spirals until she runs face first into a tree and collapses in a heap of legs and panic. Argus walks over, helps her up, doesn't scold, just says, "You'll feel better when you stop hoping." Which, wow, harsh. You can't help but wonder, was he always like this? Or did the eyes do it to him? Here's your quirky tidbit. One fringe version of Argus's origin claims that his eyes were a punishment, not a gift. That Hera gave them to him after he once accidentally napped on duty during a wedding she was officiating. So now, never again. Eternal vigilance. Eyelids optional. Historians naturally disagree. Some argue Argus was originally a sun deity, his many eyes symbolizing rays of light watching all corners of the earth. Others insist he was just a personification of guilt-induced insomnia. One scholar even posits that Argus is a metaphor for ancient Greek parents, always watching, never sleeping, silently judging your every life choice. Regardless, he's now Hera's chosen babysitter. And for a while it works. Io stops trying to escape. She stops mooing so loudly, accepts her fate with the quiet dignity of someone who's realized mooing doesn't improve anything. But something else shifts in the air, a warmth, a change in the clouds, a flute note, sharp, wandering, playing on the edge of the breeze. You glance up. Zeus! Zeus has finally done something clever, sort of. He's sending Hermes. Now, you probably know Hermes as the god of messages, shoes with wings and creative theft, but what you may not know is that Hermes is also the god of napping, on the job, improvisation and unlicensed lullabies. He doesn't do battles, he plays songs, and that flute you hear, that's the sound of rescue. It's also the sound of the world's most sleep-deprived monster slowly nodding off, but we'll get to that. For now you lie back in the meadow watching clouds drift past Argus's half-closed eyes, listening to Io chew with the resigned grace of someone whose life has taken a very, very weird turn. So here's where things get sleepy and also slightly ridiculous in that charming way only Greek mythology manages to pull off. You're lounging behind a cedar grove, watching Hermes try to act like this is just a casual afternoon serenade. He's sitting on a rock, legs crossed, twirling a flute between his fingers, like he's got nothing better to do than vibe near a paranoid cow and a many-eyed security guard. The scene could almost be peaceful, if not for the 100 eyeballs slowly swiveling in Hermes' direction. Argus, to his credit, doesn't panic. He just frowns. Well, his main face frowns. The rest of his body's eyes remain suspiciously neutral. You can tell he doesn't like being surprised, especially by someone wearing sandals with wings and a smirk you could bottle and sell as eau de trickster. Hermes nods. Lovely weather for a lullaby, don't you think? Argus doesn't answer. One of his shoulder eyes blinks independently. Hermes starts to play. It's soft, meandering. The kind of melody that drifts through your bones and settles behind your eyelids. You feel your body begin to hum at the same frequency as the grass. Even Io, tense and trembling, starts to relax her spine. Hermes is good. Like, too good. You get the sense this isn't his first mythical jailbreak. He plays songs from long-forgotten shepherd's fields, songs that goats used to fall asleep to before they were sacrificed, songs that make olive branches sway and bees forget what they were doing. The air itself leans closer, and slowly, so very slowly, the eyes begin to close. Not all at once. That would be too obvious. First it's the left hip, then an elbow, then 2 on his back, 1 on his thigh, and finally, the main set on Argus's face. The last one flickers, half shut, then fully closed. Silence. Hermes stands. Now remember, this is a rescue mission. In theory, this is the moment Hermes frees Io, lifts the enchantment, and gallops into the horizon with a freshly decowed nymph. But instead, he pulls out a rock and bludgeons Argus repeatedly, which sure is a little darker than expected, but let's face it, nobody was going to talk Argus into an unpaid vacation. And Hermes, for all his charm, is still a god. He doesn't have time for subtlety when there's a thunder deity waiting for updates and a cow prisoner chewing dandelions. With Argus down, eyes closed permanently in every direction, Hermes turns to Io. She looks skeptical, which is fair. You would be too if your best option for salvation was a half-smiling trickster who just committed celestial manslaughter with a landscaping stone. But Hermes bows, helps her stand, on 4 legs still sadly, and murmurs something reassuring. He gestures to the horizon. Freedom, escape, maybe even the river she came from if they hurry. They take off. Here's your historical fact. Hermes, in Greek myth, isn't just a messenger god. He's the patron of travelers, thieves, poets, and boundaries. His role in myths is to move things along, whether that's souls to the underworld or cows away from clingy goddesses. He shows up, breaks the narrative stalemate, and vanishes with a wink. And your quirky tidbit for tonight. There's an obscure poem from a Hellenistic bard that claims Hermes sang Argus's soul into the underworld using a lyre, because apparently killing someone with a lullaby wasn't stylish enough without a proper send-off. No one agrees on whether that's true. Historians still argue whether Hermes actually pitied Argus or just liked adding flair to his crime scenes. Either way, the point is, Io is finally free for a few minutes because, plot twist, Hera sees everything. Not immediately, not from the mountaintop, but soon enough. And when she does, she doesn't scream, she doesn't cry, she does something much more terrifying. She plucks Argus's 100 eyes, yes, all of them, and places them carefully into the feathers of her favourite bird, the peacock. Now, this might sound like a strange choice for a memorial, but Hera has always been the goddess of ceremony and symbolism. And when she's slighted, she doesn't just retaliate, she commemorates. You watch as she whispers over the bird, her voice soft and reverent, and the tail blooms in iridescent blues and greens, each eye glinting like polished secrets. This is not a reward. It's a reminder, a warning, a badge of loyalty, grief, and don't mess with me again. And here you are, floating at the edge of this divine soap opera, watching a cow limp into the distance while a bird flutters nearby, now carrying a literal gaze from the past. The myth could have ended here, but of course it doesn't. Because Hera may have turned a dead security guard into a fashion statement, but she hasn't actually forgiven anyone. And Io, her troubles are far from over. You thought maybe, just maybe, things were looking up for Io. She had a god on her side. Argus was out of the picture. The skies were clear. There were hints of freedom on the breeze. But you forgot one critical thing. Hera never lets anything go. You're standing now, well, hovering, at the edge of a newly awakened wrath. Hera has seen the footprints. She's noticed the missing cow. She's felt the silence where Argus should have been humming. And she is not amused. There's no thunder, no flash of anger. Hera's fury is slow, precise, calculated, like a spreadsheet full of grudges. She calls for a gadfly. Yes, a gadfly, not a dragon, not a plague, a tiny, insufferable, winged irritant. Because when you're a goddess of marriage and vengeance, you understand that the sharpest punishments are often the ones that linger. You watch it appear, buzzing lazily, its wings glinting gold. It zips once around Hera's crown, then darts off, a tiny missile with a single target. Ito. Now, if you're unfamiliar with cows or mythology's deep love of weird punishments, let me explain. A gadfly to a cow is like a mosquito with a jet engine. It bites, it buzzes, it never stops. And Io, she can't swat, she has no hands, only panic, she bolts. This is how you begin the next phase of the myth, the Great Cow Escape Tour. Io charges through valleys and streams, through olive groves and barley fields, across borders that haven't even been drawn yet. The gadfly follows, always. Its wings make a sound like guilt in motion. You drift behind her as she gallops across half the known world. The ancient Greeks used this myth to explain everything from river names to strange ruins. In fact, your mainstream historical fact of the night, the Greeks believed Io fled through regions that would one day become Boeotia, Thessaly, Thrace, and even parts of Asia Minor. Her frantic journey became mythic justification for the spread of certain cults and religious symbols.
Every hoofprint? A new reason to build a shrine. But Io isn't thinking about shrines. She just wants the biting to stop. At one point, she stumbles into a village square, still in cow form, mind you, and the locals drop everything. A cow galloping through town, foaming at the mouth and mooing in anguish, tends to draw attention. But here's the thing, some of them recognize her, not as a nymph, as a sign. They whisper about omens, a message from the gods. One particularly nervous farmer thinks she's the ghost of a wheat goddess. Someone else tosses garlands of garlic onto her back because apparently that's protective. Io runs faster. You chase her across a desert, past temples still under construction, past stone circles left behind by people with no written language but very specific opinions about where cows shouldn't be. And then Egypt. The Nile gleams ahead like a lazy green snake. Papyrus sways.
Crocodiles blink slowly from the banks, too dignified to care about one frantic bovine crashing into their river. Io collapses at the edge of the water. You can feel it, the stillness, the breath she's been holding for days. She wades in, hooves sinking into cool mud, and drinks deeply. The gadfly finally leaves her alone, orbiting once, then zipping away to report back. She's safe, for now. But remember, this is Greek mythology. Peace always comes with a condition. And just as Io's heart rate slows and her eyes soften, the next twist arrives. Egypt is sacred ground, and someone has to notice when a magical cow walks into it. Enter the priests. They circle her, chant, bow, offer her fruit she doesn't want and titles she didn't ask for. Because here's your quirky tidbit. In Egyptian mythology, sacred cows were a big deal. Some scholars believe this part of Io's story was later influenced by Egyptian reverence for Hathor, the goddess often depicted with cow ears or horns. So naturally, Io's arrival was interpreted as a divine visit. She doesn't get rest, she gets rituals. They name her, bathe her, cover her in gold leaf garlands. Somewhere, a lyre is playing again, and Io just stands there, blinking, tail flicking, wondering if this is better or worse than being followed by a sentient fly. Historians still argue whether the Greek myth of Io influenced Egyptian cow worship, or whether the Greeks borrowed from Egypt and grafted it into their own messy divine soap opera.
Either way, Io is now caught in yet another role she didn't apply for. And you? You're watching?
Or watching this unfold, wondering if Hera's watching too? She is. But she doesn't strike. Not yet. Hera's not interested in instant punishment anymore. No, she wants legacy. Something permanent. Something feathered. And far away, in a garden filled with echoing silences, a peacock stretches its neck and fans out its tail, its feathers gleaming with Argus's 100 eyes, a living monument to everything Hera's lost and refuses to forgive. Io won't stay in Egypt forever. There are still myths to twist, identities to steal, and gods to appease. But for now, she stands knee-deep in the Nile, unsure whether she's a prisoner, a prophet, or just a very tired cow in a story no one knows how to end. The sun hangs low over the Nile, casting everything in gold and sleepy shimmer. You're standing in a haze of incense and lotus blossom as priests chant and cattle bellow softly in the background. It's beautiful, peaceful, slightly absurd, because in the middle of all this reverence and ritual stands Io, still a cow, still deeply unimpressed, and yet the Egyptians adore her. They garland her with blue cornflowers, paint her horns with crushed lapis, call her names like Mistress of Milk and Wanderer of the Sky. They interpret her arrival as a sacred omen, a signal that the gods have touched the land again. Io just sighs and flicks a beetle off her ear. You drift beside her as the days stretch on. The Nile swells and recedes. Crops are blessed. The people are happy. For the first time since this divine mess began, Io is no longer being chased. She's being worshipped. But is it better? That's the unspoken tension in the air. Freedom isn't always peaceful, especially when it comes with expectations. She's led from temple to temple, paraded in silence, her every hoof step considered sacred. You'd think someone might ask if she actually wanted to be deified, but no one does. Because in myth, as in history, once you become a symbol, your opinion stops mattering. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Egypt, sacred animals, especially cows, were sometimes identified as physical incarnations of deities. The Apis bull, for example, was selected based on precise markings and kept in luxury until its ceremonial death. Some scholars suggest the myth of Io may have folded these real Egyptian practices into Greek narrative structure, blurring divine inspiration with anthropological curiosity. And Io, she's the prototype for this mythic cultural mashup. One afternoon, as she grazes near a painted colonnade, something shifts. You feel it before you see it. The air thickens, the shadows tighten. A breeze rustles the reeds with the familiarity of home. Zeus is here. Of course he is. He always shows up eventually, usually after everyone else has done the hard work. You spot him across the water, barely disguised as a merchant. Classic tunic, suspiciously perfect teeth, the aura of someone who's never truly apologized for anything. He waits until the priests leave, crosses the shallow stream, kneels beside Io, and she stares at him, flat, unblinking. You can tell she's not interested in small talk, or explanations, or whatever nonsense he's about to spin into destiny. He sighs, mumbles something about mistakes, about how this was never supposed to happen, about how he's trying his best, which, if we're honest, has never been a comforting phrase from anyone, let alone a thunder god. And then, finally, he lifts the curse. It's not dramatic, no lightning, no chorus of muses. One moment she's a cow, the next she's a very naked, very confused young woman standing knee-deep in mud. She blinks, breathes, looks down at her hands like they're unfamiliar tools. Her legs wobble, and then she cries. You don't blame her. Imagine living for weeks or months, trapped in a silent, grass-eating panic, only to return to a world that's still just as confusing as the one you left, and now you're famous on top of it, because yes, the Egyptians continue to worship her. She may be human again, but in their eyes, she's divine. They offer her a temple, a new name, and a position as a priestess. Io accepts. What else is she supposed to do? She stays, learns the language, blesses the crops, lives not as a nymph, not as a cow, but as a sacred intermediary between gods and people. She builds altars, lights incense, listens to prayers she doesn't always understand, and, slowly, she becomes something new. Here's your quirky tidbit. Later, Greek writers claimed that Io, once settled in Egypt, gave birth to a child, Epaphus, who became the ancestor of Egyptian kings. This was one way the Greeks explained foreign dynasties, not as other, but as mythically Greek-adjacent. It was their way of saying, sure, it's Egypt, but we kind of invented it too. Classic cultural appropriation, ancient world edition. Historians still argue whether Io's stay in Egypt was ever part of the original myth, or a later addition to explain geopolitical ties. Some think it reflects how myths were reshaped to align with real-world alliances. Others just think it was a good excuse to mention pyramids. Regardless, Io's story doesn't end here, but it pauses. She finds a fragile kind of peace. Not joy, not yet, but stillness. Enough to sleep through a night without running. Enough to sit beneath a fig tree and not flinch at every buzzing insect. And somewhere, far above her temple, Hera watches, not with rage, not with forgiveness, but with that same unreadable smile she wore when she first adopted a certain suspiciously nervous cow. And next to her, a peacock. Its tail gleams in the sunlight, each eye glittering like a silent witness to a story still unfurling. You wake to find yourself beneath a low fig canopy, the air thick with incense and goat breath, as temple goats do their sleepy bleating nearby. Io is praying, well, sort of. She's kneeling before an altar, but her eyes are distant, hands limp in her lap. The gold bangles on her wrists clink dully when she moves. She's not thinking about gods. She's thinking about birds, specifically one bird, the bird, that absurdly elegant creature whose tail feathers seem to shimmer with memory itself. The peacock. Yes, it's time we talked about the bird. Because while Io tried to build a quiet life in Egypt, Hera had moved on to branding. Somewhere on Olympus, the queen of the gods had made a decision. If she couldn't undo Zeus's betrayal or erase her own reaction to it, then she'd at least own it. She would turn shame into style, regret into regality, and she'd do it with feathers, thus the peacock. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The ancient Greeks did not originally associate peacocks with Hera. The bird wasn't native to Greece, it was imported from places like India and Persia, but sometime around the classical period, Hera adopts it as her sacred animal, possibly because of its dazzling appearance and its loud, piercing call, which, let's be honest, suits her whole vibe, your quirky tidbit. According to one Roman myth variant, Hera was jealous of Aphrodite's doves and wanted a prettier animal. The peacock, with its train of eyes, became the perfect passive-aggressive reply. Oh, you have doves? That's adorable. I have a solar-powered feather fan of eternal vigilance. Historians still argue whether Hera's connection to the peacock predates the myth of Argus or was retrofitted into it, another layer of metaphor slapped on later like olive oil over stale bread. But the result is the same. The peacock becomes not just a bird, but a mood, a warning, a moving monument to being done dirty and rising fabulously from the ashes. Back in Egypt, Io hears rumors, stories that travel across the sea, wrapped in the voices of sailors and sand traders. Tales of a bird with a tail full of eyes, eyes that once belonged to the creature who imprisoned her. She doesn't know how to feel. You watch her lean over the water basin at the temple courtyard. The sun hits the surface just right, and for a second her reflection seems feathered. She closes her eyes. Maybe it's grief, maybe it's just the heat. Io lives on, not loudly, not famously, quietly. She visits sick children, teaches girls to read grain patterns, wears linen even in the cooler months because she likes the way it whispers when she walks. But every now and then, usually around dusk, she climbs to the roof of the temple and looks west, toward the sea, toward the land where it all began. And sometimes you can almost hear Hera's voice on the wind, clipped, elegant, laced with sugar and steel. I turned a nymph into a cow. I turned a monster into feathers. But what did I turn myself into? You don't answer, because you, like everyone else in this myth, are just trying to cope. It's easy to forget sometimes, but even gods have reputations to manage. And Hera's peacock isn't just decorative, it's therapeutic, a living embodiment of her control, of her curated image. It says, I saw everything, I remember everything, and I turned it into beauty anyway. That's the thing about symbols, they're rarely just beautiful. They're weapons in disguise, and the peacock is Hera's favorite. You visit the sacred grove one evening and find an artist laying gold leaf onto a clay votive. She's painting a peacock, tail spread, eyes wide, staring outward in all directions. She doesn't know the whole story, no one does anymore, but still, she says, it's for protection. The eyes keep evil away. You want to laugh, but you don't. Because that's how myths survive. We forget the pain and keep the feathers. Meanwhile, back in the mortal world, Io grows older, slowly, gracefully. She's no longer the terrified river nymph turned cow. She's a priestess, a mother, a symbol. She still remembers, though, the grass beneath her hooves, the sting of the gadfly, the eyes that never slept, the goddess who smiled and said, mine. And somewhere far above, on Olympus, H-I-R, Olympus! Hera lounges beneath a swath of purple sky, sipping nectar from a chalice shaped like a peacock's beak. She pretends not to remember the nymph, the cow, the pain, but her bird remembers, because the eyes never close. You're drifting now through the lazy folds of a hillside orchard, where wild thyme creeps along the stones and the bees sound just a little too ambitious for this hour of day. The sky is sleepy. The olive trees are whispering. And Hermes is back. Sort of. You spot him leaning against a fig tree, his winged sandals dangling like someone who has no intention of getting involved ever again. He's chewing on a pomegranate seed and watching a goat try to chase its own tail. His expression says, I'm officially off the clock. But even Hermes isn't immune to gossip. And this story, Io the peacock, Hera's long memory, has started to echo. Not loudly, just in the background like music leaking from another room. So when Zeus quietly asks him to just check in, Hermes sighs, stretches and mutters, fine, but no flute this time. You float beside him as he glides down from the fig tree, dusts himself off and heads toward Egypt again, not as a rescuer this time, but as a messenger, a diplomat, a kind of divine apology note in sandals. When Io sees him, she doesn't flinch. That part of her life, the bolting, the trembling, the grass chewing, is over. She stands straight, her linen robe ripples in the wind. She looks exactly like someone who has grown into her scars. Zeus sent me, Hermes says, then realizing how unhelpful that sounds, adds, not like that, just to check on you. Io raises an eyebrow. Why now? Hermes shrugs. Guilt is slow. They sit beneath the same tree where, once, she collapsed in exhaustion. He tells her stories, gods tripping over their own schemes, mortals accidentally ascending into the heavens, some poor satyr who tried to invent wine smoothies and ended up cursed with hiccups for eternity. Io listens, smiles once, and then she says quietly, "Do you ever regret helping me?" Hermes looks at her. "Do you?" They don't answer, because honestly, it's complicated, but you? You remember that moment, because it's the only time Hermes ever stays. He doesn't vanish after a quip. He walks with her through the temple gardens, listens to her new chants. He even helps rearrange some ritual stones because, apparently, the local priests are building a sundial that points the wrong way, and it's driving him insane. Later that evening, he gives her something small, a feather. Not a peacock feather, a heron's, plain grey, soft, unremarkable. Sometimes, he says, you don't need to be watched, you just need to be seen. She keeps it, tucks it into the folds of her robe, doesn't cry. Meanwhile, back on Olympus, Hera is aware. She's always aware, but she doesn't interfere. She's already won in her way. The story of Io is etched into the divine record, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. The peacock struts across her courtyard, the eyes gleam brighter at sunset, and she whispers to no one in particular, "Next time I'll choose swans." Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Roman mythology, Juno, Hera's counterpart, fully adopted the peacock as her sacred bird, often depicted with a crown and a peacock by her side. This association became so strong that it carried through medieval Europe, appearing in illuminated manuscripts, cathedral carvings, and even on heraldic crests. The bird outlasted the myth. The eyes outlasted the woman. Now your quirky tidbit, there's a surviving recipe from the Roman Empire for roasting and redressing a peacock after cooking it, feathers and all. The goal to serve it looking alive and glorious, even while it was technically dinner. Leave it to Rome to make peacocks both divine and digestible. Historians still argue whether the peacock's association with vanity or vigilance came first. Some say it's because the tail looks like 100 watching souls. Others argue it was just too sparkly not to be religious. But back here, in this moment, none of that matters. Io stands under the stars, looking up. She's not afraid anymore, not running, not holy, just herself. The breeze tugs at her sleeves. Somewhere nearby, a heron croaks, and far above, Olympus rolls over in its sleep. The stars tonight are doing their usual thing, twinkling politely while pretending not to watch. But you are watching, and so is Hera, because something has changed. You're drifting over the edge of Olympus now, through air that tastes like overripe pears and ceremonial incense. Hera stands alone in the Hall of Winds, one hand on a golden railing, the other gently stroking the neck of her peacock. The bird doesn't coo, it just fans its tail in slow motion, as if to say, "Yes, we remember." Below them, the mortal world turns. Io sleeps, but Hera doesn't. Because despite all the rituals, the symbols, the carefully applied divine detachment, regret has a way of echoing, and it's loudest when the rest of the gods have stopped talking about it. So she does what any proud, supremely divine being would do when haunted by a past decision. She throws herself into projects. You follow her as she walks through her temple complex, marble floors, tall flame-lit columns, echoes of past victories carved into every inch. She pauses at a tapestry, Io as a cow, depicted mid-flight, tail raised like a banner. Hera frowns, flicks her fingers, the tapestry reshapes. Now Io is calm, dignified, grazing in a sunlit meadow, surrounded by peacocks. It's revisionist history, but woven in silk. She continues walking. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Hera's temples were some of the oldest and most architecturally ambitious in the Greek world. The Heraion of Samos and the one at Argos Both date back to the 8th century BCE. Archaeologists have found peacock-shaped votives among the ruins, suggesting the bird's symbolic connection ran deeper than aesthetics. It was part of the spiritual package. But let's get back to Hera's walk. She steps into a side chamber, dark, humid, full of offerings, fruit, statues, a perfectly symmetrical pyramid of lavender-scented candles. This is the room of regret, though no one calls it that. The other gods think it's a spare prayer chamber. Only Hera knows it's where she stores all the things she never meant to become. She kneels, not to pray, to think. You watch her run her fingers over a bowl of river pebbles, offerings from priests who believe the stones carry wishes. She lifts one. It's warm. Someone down below has asked for strength, another for justice. One, scribbled in delicate charcoal script, simply says, "Please, no more watching." She sets it down. The peacock shifts beside her, its feet making no sound on the stone. Its tail, those 100 eyes, rustles slightly. It's time to talk about those eyes. You may remember Argus, the ever-watchful, the insomniac bodyguard whose fate was to be transformed from guardian to ornament. Hera had his eyes placed into the feathers not as tribute, but as penance, a reminder to herself that vengeance should be beautiful, but also useful. That punishment should shine, but also warn. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Byzantine art, peacocks became symbols of eternal life because their flesh was believed to be incorruptible. Some mosaics even snuck them into the background of resurrection scenes. Historians still argue whether this was a holdover from Hera's divine branding, or just the artistic equivalent of, well, it's shiny, let's use it. And Hera? She walks a circle around the bird, now roosting silently beside the candle altar. She whispers, not spells, not commands, but something softer, something like a confession. You can't quite catch the words, but you do hear this. I wanted her to fear me, not become me. Then silence again. Because if we're being honest, Io and Hera were never truly enemies. They were mirrors. Io, the powerless, forced to transform to survive. Hera, the powerful, transforming others just to feel powerful again. Both tangled in Zeus's orbit, both made into something they never asked to be. One into a cow, the other into a symbol of fury so elegant no one dared question it. You float quietly as Hera stands. She leaves the chamber, walks into her garden. The stars are still watching. The peacock follows her, its tail dragging like a jeweled shadow. And then, just as she reaches the garden gate, she plucks a single feather. It's not the brightest, not the biggest, but it's the one with the oldest eye. She holds it, considers, and for the first time in a long while, she drops it into the wind. It spirals, down, 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 all the way to Egypt, all the way to a temple courtyard where a woman named Io stirs from her sleep and finds something light resting on her chest. She picks it up, smiles, doesn't know where it came from. But you do. Dawn rolls in on soft sandals. You find yourself walking beside Io through the temple gardens, where the mint bushes rustle with lizards and sleepy bees hum like a choir still warming up. She hasn't spoken yet. She's still holding that feather, the one that glided in on the night wind, light as breath, quiet as memory. It isn't a peacock feather. It's smaller, duller, but it feels older somehow, like it's watched centuries pass through slitted, silent eyes. You recognize it. It's the one Hera dropped. Io turns it over in her hands. Once, twice. She doesn't ask where it came from. She just tucks it into her sash, near the heron feather Hermes gave her. They sit together now, side by side, two gifts from gods who still don't quite know how to say sorry. And that in itself is a kind of healing. She walks with more confidence these days. The priests no longer call her Lady of the Moon's Return or Cow Who Brought the Rains. They just call her Io.
That alone feels revolutionary. You trail behind her as she
visits the lower fields, touches the tops of the barley with her fingertips. offers a few words to the sky, not a formal prayer, just a whisper of gratitude, like thanking the wind for not pushing too hard today. And there, perched atop the outer wall, is the peacock. Yes, the peacock. It doesn't move, doesn't blink, just watches. Its tail is down, tucked close, but you can still see the faint shimmer of Argus's eyes. They're duller now, not dim exactly, but resting, like they've finally stopped keeping score. And that's what brings us to the heart of this story, the moment Hera turned a nymph into a peacock. Not literally, of course. That would be weird even for Greek mythology, but symbolically, absolutely. You see, when Hera took Argus's eyes and gifted them to the bird, she wasn't just preserving memory, she was reframing the story. She made the peacock into a living artifact, a travelling monument, a decorative threat. And in doing so, she accidentally absorbed some of Io's pain. Every time someone asked, "Why does the peacock have those strange eyes?" they were also asking, who did Hera lose? What did she regret? Who did she punish so perfectly it made her uncomfortable afterward? The answer was always Io. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Even in Roman times, long after the original Greek myths had frayed and faded, the peacock endured. It showed up on coins, temple columns, and royal banquet centerpieces. The empresses of Rome draped themselves in peacock imagery to suggest they too were powerful, unflinching, divine. The bird outlived the myth because the idea of it was just too sharp, too glittering, too useful to let go. And here's your quirky tidbit. In one obscure fragment from a lost Hellenistic play, the peacock is described not as Hera's sacred animal, but as her mirror. The playwright claimed that when Hera looked into its tail, she didn't see feathers. She saw the many versions of herself she had abandoned. Historians still argue whether that was meant metaphorically or as an elaborate dig at divine vanity. Either way, it stuck with you. Io sits beneath a fig tree, not the first, probably not the last, but this one shades her just right. Her hands are busy weaving something from flax. Nothing ceremonial, just a plain cloth for a neighbour who's expecting a child. You watch the peacock hop down from the wall. It doesn't strut, doesn't fan its tail, just settles beside her, tail feathers curled like a sleeping cat. She looks at it. It looks back. There's no tension, no flash of recognition, no thunderclap of memory, just two survivors sharing silence. That's the part most myths leave out, the after. The part where no one is turning into anything, no one is running, no one is trying to rewrite the ending, they're just sitting still. And in that stillness you start to understand. Hera didn't regret turning Io into a cow or transforming Argus into feathered symbolism. She regretted the part of herself that needed to. Because anger, when left unchecked, needs to become something. In this case, it became a bird, a beautiful, tireless, exhausting bird. But anger burns out, even for gods. Io brushes a bit of dust from the bird's back. It coos. Yes, peacocks can coo. You didn't expect it either. She smiles, says nothing, because sometimes the story doesn't need a twist or a moral.
Or another transformation. Sometimes it just ends with a woman, a bird, and a feather that no longer carries weight. You're gliding now above dry hills and cracked clay paths, following a slow procession of carts, sandals, and sunburns. The year is vague, the map is speculative, but the myth is moving again. Io is travelling, not fleeing this time, not being herded, just travelling. You notice she walks near the middle of the group, flanked by people who carry baskets of dates, cloth bundles, and stories stitched into their clothing. There's a donkey with an attitude problem, a child too curious for his own good, a grandmother who keeps asking, "Are we there yet?" in 4 different dialects. Io doesn't lead. But she's clearly the reason they're going. They call her mother. Not in the biological sense, in the mythological one. As in, she once spoke to the sky and it answered. The group is heading toward the Nile's mouth, and from there to the lands beyond.
It's the next step in Io's very long, very sideways ascent from nymph to something else. And as you drift beside them, you realize this next part isn't told in any major text. It's hinted, lost in fragments, scattered in the margins of dusty scrolls. But it matters, because this is how gods become real, when mortals carry them forward on their shoulders, in their mouths, in stories that blur the lines between memory and myth. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Greeks believed that Io, after being restored to human form and honoured in Egypt, eventually returned west, either physically or symbolically, becoming part of local cults that predated the Olympian pantheon. Her name shows up in various origin tales, sometimes as a priestess, sometimes as a queen, sometimes as a mother to future dynasties. And here's your quirky tidbit. One arcane version from a 4th century BCE geographer insists that Io's wanderings were used to explain the establishment of certain temples in Sicily and Cyrene. Supposedly, anywhere she rested for more than 2 days became a sacred grove, which is a pretty clever way to justify popping up shrines every time a goat took a break. Historians still argue whether these spread-out traces of Io's legacy evidence of real cultic migration, or just a case of every town wanting a piece of divine gossip. Back in the story, Io steps off the cart path and walks toward a grove of tamarisk trees. She doesn't say why, but the group halts without asking. They're used to this, these sudden moments of quiet where she communes with something. No lightning bolts, no booming voices, just her, and the wind, and the memory of being something unhuman. She kneels, brushes her fingers through the dust, and plants a small bundle wrapped in linen, not a relic, not a sacred object, just a handful of barley from her temple gardens, her own seed. You feel the story shift again. This isn't about gods anymore. It's about continuity, about planting things that outlast the people who planted them. Io has no interest in being remembered as a victim or a symbol. She just wants to grow things, and this is where the temples come in. After the group sets camp, a few of the younger ones begin stacking stones. Nothing dramatic, just a ring, a small altar. They don't call it a temple, but they leave it behind. And the next time someone passes that way, they'll ask, "Who built this?" And someone will say, "A woman named Io. She once walked with gods." That's how it begins. By the time Io reaches the coast, there are 6 such shrines behind her. One has her name etched in broken syllables. Another features a carving of a cow with wings, deeply inaccurate, but enthusiastic. And another simply says, "She walked here." You hover beside her one morning as she watches a sunrise over water. She holds the 2 feathers again, the heron, and the one from Hera. And for the first time, she braids them into her hair, not as trophies, not as warnings, just because they're part of her. She turns to the sea. You wonder what she sees, the lands she came from, the gods who shaped her, the nymph she used to be. Probably not, probably she just sees open water and possibility. The peacock is gone now, vanished back into Olympus's mosaic walls, or maybe still strutting through some sacred courtyard, trailed by fresh initiates with expensive sandals and overly metaphorical incense. But its memory lingers, not as fear. As a turning point, Io was never a goddess, but she became something else. Something bigger than the story they tried to trap her in. And this journey, this slow, quiet walk across myth and geography, it's her rewriting the ending, one shrine at a time. The shrine is simple, rough stones stacked into a half circle, a clay basin in the middle, filled with water, and 2 sprigs of mint. No columns, no carved friezes, just stillness. You arrive just after dawn. The pilgrims are gone. Only the breeze remains, pressing through the tamarisk trees like a sigh, too polite to ask for attention. Io sits near the basin. Her feet are bare, dusty. There's flour on her hands. Apparently she spent the morning baking flatbread for a family whose son was ill. Though she never actually met the boy, that's just who she is now. Someone who shows up, offers warmth, and leaves quietly before anyone turns it into ceremony. And yet, ceremony finds her anyway. Because this shrine, the 12th she's passed since the Nile, is now blooming with offerings. Someone's left figs. Someone else carved her name beside the phrase, "To the cow who knew how to survive." It's not flattering, but it's accurate. And maybe that's better than beauty. You settle next to her in the dust. The sun hasn't climbed too high yet. The grass still glistens from last night's river mist. A heron flaps overhead. She watches it go. She doesn't say much these days. Doesn't need to. The people do the talking now. You hear them sometimes. Around fires, in markets, whispering over baskets of almonds. She travelled across the world in silence. They say her eyes remember more than the gods. My grandmother met her once, said she smelled like cedar and never stopped walking. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Greeks often connected place names and natural features to mythical wanderings. The Bosporus, for instance, literally means cows crossing, and was said to be named for the exact place Io swam as she fled Hera's wrath. The idea that a divine cow-shaped fugitive could name a strait tells you everything you need to know about how myths really travel. And your quirky tidbit? In one late Roman folk version, Io's footprints supposedly caused springs to bubble up wherever she stepped. This became a kind of ancient justification for building wells next to Io shrines. It's not a lucky accident, it's divine hooves. Historians still argue whether this was a poetic flourish or just a clever way to explain poor city planning. But here, in this moment, there are no hooves, just a woman in linen robes tying up her hair with a feather and a leather cord. Her ankles ache. She smiles at a beetle, struggling with a leaf, twice its size. You drift back from the shrine as others arrive. They don't crowd her. They don't kneel. They just sit nearby. One starts to hum, another unrolls a cloth and begins to weave a basket. It's a kind of worship, but without rules, just proximity, just stillness. One child whispers, "Is she a goddess?" His mother shakes her head. No, she's the one who remembers the gods. That seems to satisfy him. Later that day, Io pours water into the basin. It ripples once, then calms. She adds a petal, indigo, soft, not because it means anything, just because it's beautiful. This is how temples start. Not with declarations, not with marble, but with habits, a basin refilled, a feather laid gently at the base of a stone, a quiet voice repeating, "She walked here." Over time, the place will change. Someone will build a roof. Another will plant laurel. Someone else will decide this shrine needs a hymn. By then, Io will be long gone, and her name will stretch, warp, become something sung instead of spoken. She's not building a legacy, she's just walking, but people follow her footprints like scripture. And in doing so, they build something that echoes long after feathers fade and hooves grow still. This is the paradox of myth. You live quietly. You ask for peace. You plant barley. And somehow, centuries later, strangers are still offering fruit to the echo of your shadow. You arrive at dusk. The sky is a long ribbon of purple and brass, and the air smells faintly of cinnamon. Someone's burning sweetwood in a nearby courtyard. A row of fig trees leans slightly east, like they're listening to something too soft for you to hear. And here comes Hera, not as a thunderclap, not with a glare, just strolling. She's dressed in layered robes and so sheer they catch the sunset like stained glass. Her crown is understated tonight, though the gold still hums with a kind of divine frequency, like a harp that refuses to be fully silent. She's not here to smite anyone. She's here to observe. You float beside her as she walks past fountains and wind-worn statues, her sandals making no sound. The gardens are quiet, save for the peacocks, 3 of them, strutting in a diagonal formation like winged chess pieces. Their tails trail behind them, iridescent and exhausted. Hera watches them, not with pride, with calculation. It's been years, possibly centuries, depending on whose calendar you use. Io is long gone, her shrines weathered, her name now part of lullabies sung by priestesses who don't even know what a nymph is anymore. But Hera? Hera remembers everything, and tonight she's not here to relive the past. She's here to ask herself a question she's never said aloud. Was it worth it? Because let's be honest, this whole thing started with insecurity. Not power, not punishment, just fear. Fear that Zeus had chosen someone else, that someone less divine might hold his attention longer than she could. So she acted, she cursed, transformed, assigned a monster, then transformed that into fashion. She weaponized elegance, took eyes and turned them into jewelry. And in the process, she lost the thread. She walks beneath the arbor now, trailing her fingers along the vines. Grapes hang low, swollen with stories. One falls. She catches it, doesn't eat it, just watches the juice stain her hand. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Over time, Hera's image softened. The vengeful goddess of early myth gradually morphed into a more complex deity, protector of marriage, yes, but also a symbol of matronly dignity. Roman writers like Ovid painted her with more nuance, sometimes even sympathy. Art from the imperial period often depicts her seated, calm, a peacock by her side, not snarling, but serene. But that serenity, it was learned, not granted. And here's your quirky tidbit. In one obscure fragment attributed to a student of Euripides, Hera reportedly apologized to Io appearing in a dream, offering a crown of woven rain clouds and saying, "You bore what I should have shouldered." No one knows if the text was satire, fan fiction, or some early attempt at feminist reimagining, but still, it lingers. Historians still argue whether Hera's regret was real or just a narrative tool for softening her image across generations of poets who didn't know what to do with powerful women who didn't flinch. But in this moment, it feels real. She sits at the edge of the reflecting pool. The peacocks follow but stay a respectful distance. One of them lets out a cry, a sharp, plaintive sound that echoes too loud for the garden's size. She doesn't react, just looks into the water and sees herself. Not the version on temple walls, not the goddess of mosaics and more mosaics, just a woman, aging in ways the world will never see, still carrying the shape of a decision she made long ago, a decision with feathers and eyes and a name that no longer appears in prayers. She dips a finger into the water, watches the ripples erase her reflection, and for the first time you see her blink, not with pain, but with softness, as if even she knows the peacock wasn't enough. It didn't undo what happened. It didn't redeem anything. It just made it beautiful, and sometimes that's worse, because beauty can distract, reframe, make people forget who got hurt in the first place. So tonight, Hera doesn't summon lightning. She doesn't whisper curses into the pomegranate grove. She just stands, brushes the dust from her robes, and walks back toward her temple. The peacocks follow, silent this time, because even they know elegance is no substitute for peace, and regret, no matter how divine, can't be braided into feathers forever. You're drifting above Olympus now, the air crisp with altitude and memory. Below, the great marble halls shimmer in the early light, columns glowing like bones under skin. Everything looks serene, eternal. But just beneath that veneer, petty, divine gossip, because yes, even gods talk. You slip past a columned arcade and into a side courtyard, where the less busy immortals are lounging. These aren't the battle gods or thunder thieves. These are the ones with portfolios like seasonal mists and vineyard fogs. And today, they're whispering about Hera. "I heard she's keeping feathers under her bed now," one murmurs. "Please, that was last season." Now she's talking to the peacocks like they're ambassadors. "Did you hear about the feather she sent to Io?" That one hushes the others. Even here, the name still lands like a cracked amphora, shards everywhere, silence hanging. You hover in the shadows as the conversation continues. She used to be ruthless, a minor breeze deity size. Now she stares at water bowls like they're oracles. Maybe she's just tired. Aren't we all? You'd think the gossip would be cruel, but it's not. It's tired, resigned. There's something in the air here, like the aftermath of a long storm that nobody wants to name. The kind of melancholy that only shows up when the drama is over, but the consequences keep echoing. And you realize it's not just mortals who live with regret. Immortality doesn't come with amnesia, just longer memory. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the Hellenistic period, Greek poets had begun writing tragedies and odes that painted the gods as deeply emotional beings, often selfish, yes, but also capable of loneliness, uncertainty, and exhaustion. Hera, in particular, became a symbol of divine wounded pride, her actions reframed as protective, not petty. Poets began asking not, what did Hera do, but why did she feel she had to? And here's your quirky tidbit. In one unearthed vase painting from Magna Graecia, Hera is shown removing a peacock feather and placing it on an altar. Not holding it, not wearing it, laying it down, solemnly. Some scholars interpret this as symbolic surrender. Others say it's just an odd decorative choice. But still, it says something. Historians still argue whether that image reflects a lost ritual of Hera's cult, or just an artist with a very specific vision of divine vulnerability. Back in the courtyard, the gossip begins to fade. Someone brings out honeyed figs. Another dozes off mid-sentence. Even immortals need naps. You leave them and follow the breeze down a corridor you haven't visited before. It's dim, quiet, and lined with forgotten votives, small clay cows, miniature eyes painted on stone. Scraps of linen, each scrawled with a name, Io, Epiphas, Argus. You realize this is a storage room of stories. Not the glamorous ones, the messy, quiet ones, the ones Hera doesn't display anymore. You feel her before you see her. She's standing in the corner. No crown, no entourage, just Hera, alone, her hands folded in front of her like she's waiting for something that's already happened. She looks at one of the clay cows, picks it up, turns it over in her fingers, then gently places it back. It's not penance, it's not an apology, it's maintenance, because even divine mistakes need dusting sometimes. She doesn't see you, or maybe she does and chooses not to acknowledge it. Instead, she walks slowly around the room, touching each object once, like she's counting them, not in shame.
Not even in mourning, just to remember, because this is her legacy too, not the temple.
Not the temples, not the peacocks, not the iconography etched into coins and tapestries, but this room, the part of the story that never made it into marble, the part where she became human enough to know she went too far. She pauses at the doorway, looks back once, and then she's gone, leaving only the soft scent of crushed mint and feather oil behind her. You're drifting now across sea foam and salt breeze, far from Olympus, far from temples, far from the eyes, those many watchful eyes that still shimmer faintly in the corners of stories. You've crossed into the edge of Egypt again. And there, beneath a fig tree that has split a stone altar clean in half with its roots, sits Io. She is older now, not aged in the way mortals do, but weathered, settled, like driftwood, polished by decades of quiet waves. She wears a plain linen shift tied with twine, no gold, no sandals. Her hair is streaked with grey, though it glints like burnished bronze in the sunlight. The two feathers, heron and Hera's, are still braided together, now faded, tucked just behind her ear, like a secret she doesn't need to share anymore. She doesn't speak much these days, but people still come. They bring her bread, milk, news from the northern provinces, small wooden carvings of cows offered with a sheepish reverence that makes her smile without showing teeth. She asks only one thing from those who visit. Tell me where you walked, that's all. And so they do. A child tells her about a blue pebble found on the banks of the Nile that looked exactly like an eye. A woman from Thebes recounts a dream in which she flew briefly as a bird made of feathers and salt. A shepherd swears he saw a goddess standing ankle-deep in his barley field at dawn, whispering to the stalks in a voice like wind over milk. Io listens. She doesn't nod or correct or even ask follow-up questions. She just receives, the way rivers receive rain, the way myths receive new endings without protest. You settle beside her, close enough to hear the fig leaves rub together. They sound like pages turning. And somewhere in the distance, there's the cry of a peacock. Faint. Not mournful, just present. The kind of sound that says, I'm still here too. But Io doesn't turn her head. She already knows. The peacock is part of her now, not following, not threatening, just folded into her shadow the way myths fold into the soil. The sound of the bird's cry rolls over the land like thunder that forgot to be angry. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In some ancient genealogies, Io is credited as the great-grandmother of Hercules, yes, that Hercules, through her son Epaphus and his descendants. In this way, she becomes more than a myth. She becomes infrastructure, part of the scaffolding that holds up the entire heroic age. Her story, once personal and painful, becomes ancestral, and your quirky tidbit, in a rare Etruscan bronze mirror, Io is depicted not as a cow, not even as a woman, but as a hybrid. Human torso, cow legs, crowned in river reeds. A figure both sacred and absurd. Historians still argue whether it was meant as a symbol of transformation or a cosmic joke about divine proportions. Either way, it survives, because sometimes the weirdest artifacts are the ones that outlast everything else. You watch as another visitor approaches, an old man with sun-baked hands and a crooked cane. He sits across from Io, and for a long time they don't speak. He pulls out a small clay cow from his satchel. It's cracked down the middle, mended with golden glue. Io takes it gently, traces the line, then sets it between them. "That's how the light gets in," she murmurs, not quoting anything, just knowing. The man nods. That's all. You linger there, in that silence, in that mutual knowing, because this is what forgiveness actually looks like. Not absolution. Not rewriting the past, just existing inside it, fully, without letting it own you. Later, as the sun begins to slip behind the hills, Io rises. She carries the clay cow to the base of the fig tree and places it beside dozens of others, some old, some new, all gently worn by time and rain. It's not a shrine, not exactly. It's more like a nest, a resting place for things once broken. And then she does something she's never done before. She unties the feather braid from her hair. She doesn't discard it. Just places it carefully atop the newest clay cow, the heron feather, the peacock eye, braided no longer, resting instead. You know what this means. She's ready to stop carrying it, not forget, just let it go. That night, as stars pierce the sky, one by one, a heron glides across the moon. A peacock somewhere fluffs its tail without fanfare, and Io, alone on her woven mat, sleeps without dreams. Because there's nothing left to outrun, only the stories that come tomorrow, and the soft sound of leaves turning, always turning, like memory, learning how to breathe. The sun rises in ribbons again, soft, familiar, almost apologetic. It spills through the fig branches like an old friend creeping into a quiet room. And you're already awake, hovering just beyond the courtyard, watching the world continue. Io is gone, not vanished, not ascended, just moved on. No one saw her leave. There was no farewell speech, no dramatic final gesture. One morning, her mat was empty, the basin dry, the fig tree unusually still. And now, all that remains are the clay cows beneath the tree, each one slightly tilted, like they've leaned in to listen for her return. She didn't leave a note. She didn't need to. Her story had already rooted itself in the soil. But that doesn't mean the questions stopped. You float through town after town, listening to whispered theories. She turned into a river. She returned to the stars. She followed the peacock and disappeared into the sky. They say she was never real, just a symbol. And yet, the flowers still bloom near her shrines. The herons still land in the same shallow waters. And the peacocks? They've multiplied. No longer just ornaments for Hera's processionals. They now wander temple courtyards, village gardens, and old pilgrimage roads, unclaimed, untethered. Symbols, yes, but not for regret anymore. For resilience. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the Roman imperial era, peacocks were so revered they appeared in funerary art as symbols of the soul's immortality. They strutted through mosaics in villas, were sculpted into fountains, and adorned coins of empresses like Faustina and Julia Domna. Their tails, once a divine punishment, had become an emblem of eternity. And your quirky tidbit? In one medieval bestiary, likely translated from Greek, the peacock is said to eat venomous snakes and not be harmed, and its flesh never spoils. This led to the myth that peacocks were incorruptible, a belief so persistent that some European monasteries buried feathers with saints to delay decay. Historians still argue whether this reverence came from myth, metaphor, or sheer admiration for how obnoxiously gorgeous peacocks are. Back in your story, something new is happening. People have begun telling Io's story differently. She's no longer the cow, not the victim, not even the wanderer. Now she's the returner. In one version, she builds irrigation canals wherever she walks. In another, she teaches women how to interpret dreams by the shape of a heron's shadow. In yet another, your favorite, she becomes a midwife to queens, appearing in the moment of crisis, whispering advice, then disappearing with the morning mist. You begin to see it clearly. Io isn't a person anymore. She's become a pattern, a way to explain the quiet, persistent survival that lives in so many places, the temple that wouldn't collapse, the spring that never dried, the mother who kept going after everyone else turned back. That's how myths endure, not by staying the same, but by changing shape again and again, just like she did. At the edge of a harbour town, you spot a young girl braiding feathers into her hair. Two of them, one grey, one blue-green. When asked what they mean, she shrugs. My grandmother said it keeps you from being watched by cruel eyes. Is it from Hera? The vendor asks. No, the girl replies. It's from someone who walked away. You hover above them, smiling, because that's the story now. Io, the one who walked, not into tragedy, not into vengeance, but out of it. She walked across the world and left no footprints, just temples, feathers, and the gentle belief that no matter what they turn you into, you can still choose what you become next. And somewhere far above, a feather drifts unnoticed from a high window of Hera's temple. Not dropped in grief, but perhaps in relief. The wind changes, you feel it first, just a shift in the way the grass leans, the way the olive branches pause mid-rustle, as if holding their breath. You're no longer in Io's world exactly. You've crossed into the space where story and memory blur, where myth wraps itself around the real like ivy over stone. You're in a festival now, not one of the grand, booming affairs with marble columns and indecipherable chants. No, this is a local festival, a sleepy coastal town, baskets of figs, a goat tied to a post with a wreath of daisies on its head, children in tunics slightly too long, an old woman telling the story of a girl who became a cow, then a ghost, then a goddess, and then, eventually, just a woman again. The crowd listens, some half asleep, some fully asleep, but all listening. You drift closer. The storyteller is standing beneath a tree, not a fig this time, but an almond. She has one feather tucked behind her ear and an amphora of diluted wine that she sips between paragraphs. She doesn't rush. She lets the silences do the heavy lifting. And then, she says, Io came to a place where no one knew her name, and instead of telling them, she stayed quiet. She grew herbs. She taught the river how to curve around the rocks. She asked no one to remember her, but the land did. A boy near the front raises his hand. Did she ever turn back into a cow? No, the woman replies with a smile. But some days she still chewed slowly. The crowd chuckles. So do you. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Some ancient Greek festivals were held in honor of local nymphs, minor deities or mythic figures tied to springs, hills, and rivers. Offerings were made not to statues, but to landmarks, a pool, a tree, a breeze. It was a way of keeping memory alive without architecture. Io's story, especially in rural areas, was folded into this tradition. She became one of the walked here spirits, not prayed to exactly, just acknowledged. And your quirky tidbit? In a 1st century CE letter from a Roman merchant to his wife, there's a line that says, "Don't forget to leave barley at the rock, shaped like the sleeping cow." The healer said it protects from fevers. That's it, no context. But it suggests that even by then, Io had slipped from her divine status and become something even stickier, a custom. Historians still argue whether such references indicate true cultic survival or were just the ancient equivalent of "my grandma swears by it." Either way, it worked. Back in the festival, people begin lighting lanterns, soft things, paper stretched over twigs painted with feathers, cows, rivers, and eyes. The kind of art made by people who no longer fear the symbols, but carry them like bedtime stories. They float them down the river. You follow. Dozens of glowing orbs wobble gently on the water's surface, their reflections trembling like sleepy thoughts. One lantern carries a tiny clay cow. Another holds a feather tied with twine. A third simply says, "I forgave you," no signature. But you know who it's for. As the lanterns drift away, a chorus begins. Nothing elaborate. A low hum like bees in a cave. The kind of melody that doesn't need words to feel ancient. It sounds like dusk, like feet that have walked too far, like a heart that doesn't break anymore. It just remembers how to bend. And above it all, the stars blink down, not watching. Just there. You look around. The storyteller has finished. The crowd has wandered off. The almond tree sways. You're alone now, but you don't feel abandoned. You feel accompanied, as if something just walked past you, unseen, barefoot, calm, and in the wake of that presence, you whisper to no one in particular. "She walked here," and the leaves respond, softly. She still does. You follow the river, not Io's river, exactly, just a river that feels like it remembers her. It winds gently through low hills and sleepy olive groves, the kind where time seems reluctant to move forward. The banks are thick with reeds and half-forgotten myths. You come upon a Roman villa crumbling now but once grand, columns half-swallowed by vines, mosaic floors dulled by rain and feet, yet beneath the grime you see it, a peacock, tiled in blue and green glass, its tail sweeping dramatically across the atrium floor, each feather tip a gleaming eye, still open, still watching. You float closer. It's not just decoration, not just vanity. This peacock was placed here deliberately, a centerpiece, a statement, and suddenly it clicks. The peacock didn't just survive Hera's regret, it outlived everyone. You wander through the rest of the villa, more mosaics. On one wall, Hera sits enthroned with a peacock at her side, her face unreadable. On another, Io, barefoot, arms raised, surrounded by reeds, half cow, half goddess, half forgotten. The scenes are inaccurate, stylized, but the intention is clear. These Romans didn't just inherit the myths, they remixed them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Peacocks became a status symbol across the Roman Empire. Imported from India, they were kept in villa gardens, painted into frescoes and carved onto tombs. Wealthy families associated themselves with the bird not because they worshipped Hera, but because they liked what the bird represented: beauty, vigilance, and divine association without the divine baggage. And your quirky tidbit? The Emperor Domitian had peacock feathers sewn into the hems of his cloaks, not just embroidered, actual feathers. His critics said he dressed like Hera's valet. His supporters claimed he was a new kind of god. Historians still argue whether he genuinely admired the bird or was just trolling everyone from a marble balcony. But back here in this half-buried villa, the story's more delicate. In a side room, maybe a bedroom once, you find a small mural nearly rubbed away. It's a woman standing in a field, no cows, no feathers, just her. And scratched below it in crude Latin, a single line, "She walked farther than they knew." It's not a boast, it's a confession. You leave the villa and follow the path east where the ground rises toward what once might have been a temple. Just a few stones now, but enough to mark a place. A pause, a story. A family is picnicking nearby. The grandmother, grey hair pulled back in a scarf, points toward the ruins and tells the children. That's where she turned the Peacock into a river. The children blink. "That's not how it goes," one mutters. "Stories grow," the grandmother says, picking a fig. "You don't have to like it. You just have to listen." And this is how it happens. Oyo becomes part of the landscape, not just a character, a contour, a bend in the river, a grove of fig trees, a shrine with a missing name. She isn't always recognized anymore. Sometimes people think she was a goddess of migration, or of cows, or of lost things that made their way home, but always, always, she's there. You drift high above the fields as the day fades. A farmer stands at the edge of a canal, resting on his hoe. He says to no one, "I heard this water used to follow a woman." His son beside him says, "Was she pretty?" "No," the farmer says. "She was tired." They both nod. And below, nestled beside the water, a single peacock feather lies caught in the reeds. No one notices it, but you do, and you leave it there, because not every symbol needs to be picked up again. Some are meant to rest. You're in a marketplace now. Not a grand marble agora, or the kind that echoes with political debate. This one is quieter, sun-warmed, filled with the comforting chaos of everyday life. Baskets of olives, clay jugs of oil, bunches of thyme still dusted with soil. Chickens peck between sandal straps. Laughter hums just beneath the haggling, and there, strung like laundry between two crooked beams, hangs a tapestry. It's simple, coarse wool, faded dye, but you recognize the pattern instantly. A feathered tail, eyes stitched into every strand. You drift closer. The vendor catches you looking and smiles. "Protection," she says, tapping the fabric. "Hang it near the door, keeps bad dreams from walking in." "Peacocks?" you ask. "Depends who you ask," she shrugs. "My grandmother said they were full of gods, or guilt, or maybe both." She leans in conspiratorially. "Some say the eyes see truth, others say they just remember everything." You nod, because both are true. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In some late Byzantine and early Christian traditions, the peacock retained its association with divine watchfulness, often appearing in mosaics and stone carvings, not to honor Hera, but to symbolize the all-seeing nature of the afterlife, or even the eye of God. Of its many eyes shifted meaning, evolving with each retelling, each new layer of cultural sediment. And your quirky tidbit? In a 10th century herbalist's manual, there's a footnote advising patients to burn a peacock feather in a sick room to drive out false visions. Whether this was based on myth, observation, or panic, we'll never know. But it shows how thoroughly the bird's symbolism seeped into everyday life. Historians still argue whether the peacock's enduring legacy came from Hera's myth directly, or whether it simply fit too well into the symbolic needs of each new era. But you know better. You know it started with Io, not the bird, not the god, the girl, the one who kept walking. Back in the marketplace, a young man holds up a small amulet, a lump of glass, inside which a feather has been fused mid-fold. He doesn't know who Io was, doesn't even know the feathers from a peacock, but he wears it around his neck anyway. "Helps me stay awake during long watches," he explains. He grins. "Eyes, right?" You smile because it's true. Even now, the eyes still linger, on feathers, in thread, in old stories told around kitchen fires when the power goes out and all anyone can do is remember. Later, in a narrow alley, you find a small shrine carved into the wall, just a niche with a bowl and a scratched inscription. The words are worn but legible. An offering to the one who knew how to be seen and still survive. There's a single coin in the bowl and a pebble and a blue-green feather. You stay for a while, not praying, just being there. Because that's what this moment is for, not reverence, not revelation, just witness. You turn to leave and pause. On the far wall, etched faintly into the stone by a hand not trained for chiseling, are two shapes, a cow and a bird. No labels, no names, just symbols, perfectly balanced. One hoofprint, one tail, one feather, one eye. They don't tell the whole story, but they tell enough. You find yourself walking through dust. Not dramatic, wind-swept desert dust, but the everyday kind. The soft coating that settles on temple steps, cloaks the feet of pilgrims, lingers in the air between one story ending and the next beginning. You're on a quiet road now, stone slabs underfoot, worn smooth by centuries of sandals. The trees overhead are twisted with age, their shadows broken into mosaics across the path. A path. It's the kind of road that doesn't lead to a city or a battlefield, but to a memory. And at the bend in this road, a statue, roughly carved, weather-worn, but unmistakable. It's Io, not Io the cow, not Io the priestess, just Io, standing tall, chin lifted, her hand resting on the back of a small, unadorned peacock. The bird looks up at her. The expression is unreadable. The tail is folded, the eyes are closed. You approach quietly. At the base of the statue is a stone bench, and on it someone has left an offering, a bundle of herbs, a strip of linen, a single line scratched into the stone. Still walking, you sit for a while. No one else passes. The world feels paused. The statue casts a long shadow, and you notice that it isn't facing the road. It's turned slightly west toward the hills, as if watching something beyond the path, something still coming. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Io's story rarely ended cleanly in mythic texts. She reappears in fragments, mentioned in passing, traced through genealogies, invoked in temple litanies, but she never fully vanishes. Her name lingers like a footnote with no page reference, a whisper in every myth about exile, transformation, or escape. And your quirky tidbit? On the island of Delos, archaeologists found a stone basin marked with an inscription, to the one who crossed the sea without crying out. No name. But the carving beside it was unmistakable, a set of 4 cow hooves and a trail of feathers. Historians still argue whether that was truly for Io or some local variant, or perhaps just a poetic misreading, but the basin remains, full of rainwater, still visited. Back on the path, a breeze lifts a few leaves across your feet. They spiral, settle, and something shifts in the air. You're no longer walking behind Io, you're walking with her. Because that's the truth no one carves in stone. Myths don't end. They disperse. They echo in new voices, reappear in different robes. Every time a girl runs from something bigger than herself and keeps going anyway, Io walks again. Every time someone is silenced, watched, and still finds a way to make their own story, Io lives again, not in marble, not in shrines, but in movement. You rise from the bench and continue down the road. The light has softened. The pebbles beneath your steps feel less sharp. Ahead, a child is skipping with a satchel of feathers, humming a song with no clear words. As you pass, she looks up and says, "Did you see the bird?" You nod. "I think it likes her," she says. "Who?" you ask. "The one who walked." And just like that, she skips away. You reach the end of the path as the sun begins to dip, its last light brushing the hills in bronze. You pause, then take one more step, because the only way to honor the story is to keep walking. You're in a library now, not a grand one. No marble lions, no domed ceiling with cherubs pointing dramatically towards scrolls. Just a modest room carved into the side of a hill, walls lined with uneven shelves and wooden ladders that creak with wisdom. Dust motes hang in the sunbeams like lazy punctuation marks. The scrolls here aren't neatly organized. They lean against one another like old friends. Some are wrapped in cloth, some are tied with reeds, Most aren't labelled. You don't need to search long. In the corner, on a shelf marked Fragmenta, unfiled, you find it. A single slip of papyrus. Faded, cracked, but readable. It begins. Some say Hera loved the bird before the eyes. Others say she only loved the eyes and gave the bird so it could carry them without complaint. You sit and read. It's not a complete story. More like a scholar's marginal notes. A half-remembered quote from a play that no longer exists. A reference to an epic where the woman who fled in silence appeared as a whisper in someone else's dream. You smile, because even here, in the quiet stacks of forgotten stories, Io lingers, but the scholar, whoever they were, has opinions. In looping, ink-blotted lines they write, "It is no longer certain whether the peacock was always hers. Some say it was borrowed. Some say it followed her out of pity. Some say it watched her with Argus's eyes and could never unsee what it saw." You pause there. Because that's the line. That's the moment you feel it, how mythology works like tidewater, how stories get pulled, reshaped, pushed back into new forms. One era says the bird was divine. Another says it was cursed. A third insists it wasn't a bird at all, but a metaphor for guilt with feathers. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The academic record on Hera and the peacock is full of contradictions. Some sources claim the bird originated in Mesopotamian mythology and was adopted into the Greek world via trade routes. Others insist its association with Hera was a late development, possibly a post-Homeric, used to retroactively give her an animal as symbolic as Zeus's eagle or Athena's owl. And your quirky tidbit, a few modern folklorists suggest that the eye-covered tail of the peacock wasn't a gift from Hera at all, but a punishment. That the bird was once proud and plain, but after witnessing something divine it should not have seen, it was burdened with eternal sight. Historians still argue whether that's ancient or just a clever modern myth trying to make sense of something uncomfortably beautiful. You tuck the scroll back where you found it, carefully. The librarian, an old man with a quill tucked behind one ear and fig jam on his sleeve, shuffles past. Sees you lingering, smiles. "Looking for the truth?" he asks. "No," you reply, "just the eyes." He chuckles. "Then you're in the right section." You leave the library. Step back into sunlight, and there, in the courtyard, is a statue you hadn't noticed before. Not of Io, not of Hera, of the peacock. Its tail is folded, its neck proud, its feet planted in a way that suggests it knows too much. Around its base are tiny offerings, feathers, scraps of fabric, one carefully balanced amphora filled with olive oil and a single violet. The plaque says, "For the bird who saw everything and said nothing." That's it, not a story, just a sentence. And somehow that says more than any epic. Because sometimes the eyes don't mean accusation, sometimes they mean understanding. You step back, the statue's shadow stretching toward your feet, and for a moment you feel like it's still watching, not as a curse, as a reminder that stories don't disappear, they just shift shape. And sometimes they wait quietly for someone like you to come looking again. You wake to the sound of parading footsteps and the metallic hiss of chariots rolling over crushed rose petals. It's a procession, ornate, lavish, slightly excessive and unmistakably Roman. You've wandered into an imperial festival. Trumpets are blaring. Perfume hangs in the air like polite fog. Someone's tossing flower crowns into the crowd from a balcony. A man in a toga too clean to trust is shouting about divine blessings and eternal vigilance. And in the center of it all, peacocks, real ones. 2 harnessed to a ceremonial cart. You blink. Yes, they've yoked actual peacocks to a miniature golden chariot. They aren't pulling it, obviously. They're mostly strutting beside it, confused but radiant. But no one seems to care. The symbolism is doing the heavy lifting here. This is not Hera's world anymore. This is Rome. And the bird, it's been rebranded. The announcer, voice trained like an actor, calls out, "Behold the sacred messengers of Juno Regina, Empress of Heaven, Matron of Matrons, and Guardian of Imperial Virtue." Crowd cheers. You hover above the spectacle. Somewhere behind the gold and the incense and the bronze faces of glowering senators, you sense it, the remnants of Io's story still stitched into the margins. But it's faded now, disguised, because the Romans, ever eager to inherit without attribution, folded Hera into Juno, smoothed out her temper, gave her more respectability, less thunder, more protocol. And the peacock? Oh, the peacock flourished. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the height of the Roman Empire, the peacock was firmly enshrined as Juno's sacred animal. It appeared on imperial coins, imperial seal rings, and frescoes across elite Roman homes. Empresses were often compared to Juno and, by extension, adorned themselves with peacock imagery as a symbol of divine legitimacy and watchful grace. And your quirky tidbit? At one imperial banquet, Emperor Elagabalus reportedly served roasted peacock tongues as a delicacy, presented on a golden tray shaped like a fan of feathers. Guests were encouraged to speak their truths after tasting the eyes of the gods. One senator allegedly passed out. 2 others converted to Stoicism by dessert. Historians still argue whether the peacock's association with divine queenship made it a true religious icon, or whether it simply became luxury branding for the empire's elite. Probably both. You move past the parade, follow the feathers as they trail down quiet alleys, the pomp fades, and you find yourself in a mosaic workshop. It's warm, dusty. A boy is grinding malachite into powder while an older woman arranges tiny blue tiles in the corner of a large, floor-bound peacock. The bird's tail spans nearly 5 feet in radius, dozens of eyes, all watching, all perfect. Temple commission? You ask. The woman shakes her head. No, she says. A villa. They wanted something divine near the baths. She pauses. I asked if they wanted Io. Io? You blink. She shrugs. They didn't remember the name, just said, "We want the bird that saw everything and forgave nothing." She looks back at the feathers. I think they mean Juno now.
But it's still her, isn't it? You nod. Because it is. Even if no one says her name. Even if they forget the cow, the river, the eyes.
The walk. The bird remembers. So do I. Os. So do you. And so does the art. Because mosaics are made of fragments. Tiny broken things arranged until they make a new whole. A pattern. A symbol. Like a story you walk through. Or a myth you wear without realizing. You watch as the woman places one final tile into the center of the peacock's breast, a soft green square surrounded by gold, the heart. And then she dusts her hands and says, "There, that's the truth of it." And you don't ask what she means, because you already know. The scent of cardamom and heat-warmed stone lingers in the air as you step off the Roman roads and into new lands. You've crossed another threshold, eastward now, into places where the peacock was never borrowed, never symbolized regret or divine pettiness. Here, it was always sacred, always resplendent, always royal. You're in India, and the peacock isn't a side character anymore. It's the national bird, a symbol of sovereignty, of beauty, sure, but also of reign, rebirth, and divine protection. You walk through temple gardens lined with marigolds where peacocks stroll with the confidence of minor deities. No one chases them, no one cages them. They're watched, yes, but not owned. They belong here. In one village courtyard, you pass a painted wall depicting Krishna, the beloved Hindu god, playing his flute, a peacock feather tucked into his crown. A boy points at it and says to his sister, "See? He wears the feather because it listens." And you pause, because that's exactly what it does. It listens. It always has. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Indian mythology, the peacock is associated with a host of deities, not just Krishna, but also Saraswati, goddess of wisdom, and Kartikeya, god of war, whose mount is a peacock named Paravani. The bird represents protection, beauty, knowledge, and even the power to consume evil, an inversion of its Greek associations with pride and watchfulness. And your quirky tidbit? In one Vedic hymn, it's said that the peacock's cry is the voice of the clouds calling the monsoon. Farmers used to predict rain based on the bird's song. Some still do. Historians still argue whether the Greek view of the peacock as divine but vain was shaped by unfamiliarity with its natural behaviours, or whether that interpretation was just projection. Because here, in the Indian tradition, vanity isn't the point. Presence is. You wander through a Mughal palace, ornate inlay, carved columns, windows designed to catch wind in quiet, meaningful ways. In the audience chamber, you find it, the peacock throne. Well, a reconstruction. The original is long gone, looted, melted, scattered, but the replica stands tall. Gold and emerald, ruby and sapphire. At its peak, two enamelled peacocks facing each other, tails fanned, forming an arch of glittering eyes. It's magnificent. And beneath it, a bronze plate inscribed in Persian script. Let he who sits here see all, not with suspicion, but with wisdom. You stand in its shadow and realize that somewhere along the journey the myth has inverted itself. The peacock, once a tool of Hera's regret, has become a symbol of clarity. It no longer watches in jealousy, it understands. You float through corridors where artisans still paint the bird onto silk and carve it into the handles of ceremonial daggers. You pass a young monk sweeping temple steps who tells you the peacock dances when the storm is close, not in fear. In welcome, you nod, because that too is Io's legacy, though no one here would call her that. Her name may be lost in this place, but her journey, still unfolding. You remember Io, mid-transformation, struggling between cow and woman, voice and silence, symbol and person. She would have understood the peacock better in this land, not as a punishment, but as proof that something painful could one day mean something else, something larger, wiser, unafraid. You return to the garden. The peacocks are still there, heads tilted toward the clouds. One cries out, sharp, electric, and the sky answers, a single drop of rain, then another, then a full-throated monsoon rushes in. The peacocks begin to dance, not for you, not for gods, just because they can. You hear the bells before you see the paintings, not loud ones, just the soft metallic chime of distant chapel ropes stirring gently in the wind. You're standing in the courtyard of a medieval monastery now, somewhere in southern France. The walls are thick, the stones moss-kissed, and the air smells faintly of ink, wax, and lentil stew. You've crossed into yet another telling. This time the story hides in parchment. You step into the scriptorium, a long, narrow room lit by slanted windows. The monks here work in silence, their quills dancing across vellum, pigment jars lined like relics. You hover near one desk, and there, in the margins of a manuscript tucked beside a psalm, is a peacock. It's tiny, just 3 inches tall. Gilded feathers, tail fanned with painstaking care. No caption, no context, but unmistakable. You flip gently through the rest, and there it is again, and again. Peacocks in trees, peacocks sipping from fountains, peacocks beside angels, saints and sleeping lions. You ask the monk. He smiles softly and whispers, "They're reminders." Of what? You ask. That beauty doesn't die. He returns to his writing. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Christian art from the late antique and medieval periods, peacocks became a potent symbol of resurrection. This likely stemmed from the Roman myth that their flesh didn't decay, combined with older Greek and Eastern imagery. Churches carved them into altar fronts, grave markers, and choir stalls. They appeared not as Hera's watchers, but as Christ's messengers of immortality. And your quirky tidbit? In the 6th century Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, 2 jewel-toned peacocks flank a fountain on the apse mosaic. Some believe it represents the waters of paradise. Others say it's a visual pun, a wink to those who know the bird's older stories and understand that transformation doesn't always erase the past. It repurposes it. Historians still argue whether the Christian adoption of the peacock was conscious reinterpretation or simply aesthetic inheritance. But one thing is clear: the bird endures. Even here, in this monastery, where Hera's name has been long forgotten and Io's fate never made it into the liturgy, the feathers remain. You walk through a cloister garden. 2 peacocks wander through the grass, gifts from a noble patron, the monk tells you. They arrived in spring, he says, and haven't left. They sleep near the statue of St. Agnes. She doesn't seem to mind. He laughs, then pauses. One of the novices swears he heard the larger one speak once, said it whispered, "I was once a god's regret." You raise an eyebrow. The monk shrugs. I said novice, not reliable. But later that day, as vespers rise and the peacocks settle into their stone alcove, you catch it, a feather, wedged into a crevice of the chapel wall. Old, frayed, but still shimmered blue-green in the candlelight. Not part of the official iconography, not gilded or planned, just there, like a bookmark left between centuries. A reminder that stories echo even when their names have faded, that a bird once burdened with 100 watchful eyes can, centuries later, become a symbol of hope. And somewhere, deep in the ancient folds of time, you imagine Io smiling. Not because she's remembered, but because the meaning has changed. She, who once fled through reeds and rain, now lives in stone and song, in feathers, in margins, in every place where beauty survives the pain that first gave it form. You've left the monasteries behind now. Gone are the stone walls, the candle-lit halls, the quiet Latin prayers. You're walking along a grassy slope where the only script is birdsong, and the only illumination is the late afternoon sun warming the edges of a crumbling shrine, forgotten by cartographers, remembered only by weather and time. It doesn't look like much. 3 standing stones, a pile of smoothed river rocks, 1 half-buried ceramic fragment, its glaze long since faded. But someone has been here recently. There are signs, a bunch of dried lavender tied with flax cord, a single grey-white heron feather pressed into the crook of the largest stone. And beside it, a cow's hoofprint, not fossilized, fresh in soft earth. Probably a coincidence, but not to you. You kneel, fingers brushing the feather, and listen. No wind, no voices, just presence. This place doesn't know whether it's sacred anymore, but it remembers trying to be, and you realize this shrine doesn't belong to Hera, or Juno, or Krishna,
or even Io. It belongs to all the moments when someone was running, all the moments someone was watched and kept walking anyway. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Even in the wake of the Enlightenment, when myths were dismissed as quaint or primitive, folk traditions continued to quietly honour figures like Io. In rural parts of Greece, shepherds told tales of the white cow woman who walked along ridgelines and brought rain. In Cyprus, children left feathers on their windowsills so the watching eyes would sleep. None of these were official cults, but they were survivals. And your quirky tidbit. In an 1830s travel diary from an English antiquarian, there's a sketch of a shrine in Thessaly labelled Io's Rest. The notes beside it read, "Locals claim animals will not cross the boundary stones, and that dreams are vivid here."
The author dismisses it as superstition, but he slept outside the circle that night just in case. Historians still argue whether such persistent scraps of ritual were remnants of ancient cults or accidental echoes. But does it matter? You know what it is. It's memory, layered, scattered, quietly resilient. Like Io. You stand and begin to walk again. Teet, LK again. The trail is narrow but familiar. You've followed it through Olympus, Egypt, Rome, India, monasteries, mosaics, and back to places where myth breathes quietly under moss. And here, at this bend in the path, you find a tree. Not a fig, not an olive. Something unremarkable, actually. Small, leafing out into green fingers, bark streaked with pale lichen. Tied around its trunk is a loop of twine. Attached to it, 2 feathers, one grey, one eye spotted, weathered, fraying, still holding their shape. You smile, because now you know the story's not just being told, it's being passed on. A girl arrives behind you, alone, barefoot, carrying a jug of water and a bundle of herbs. She sees the tree, the feathers, doesn't say anything, just unties the twine, replaces the bundle with a new one, rosemary and dried apple peel, and reties it gently. "Who is it for?" you ask. She glances up. "I don't know her name," she says, but she kept going. Then she walks past you, down the trail. You turn to follow, but something catches your eye. Carved into the tree, not deeply, but intentionally, is a phrase. 4 words. You lean in, she walked. We walk. No attribution, no punctuation, no divine flourish, just truth. You stay a while, not because the myth needs you, but because it welcomed you. And long after the gods forget, long after feathers rot and statues crumble, someone will come here, maybe barefoot, maybe not, and they'll see the feathers, and they'll know the story walked here, so can they. You walk now through the soft dusk of olive fields, the trees casting long shadows like outstretched fingers, trying to remember what they once held. The wind is gentle, not urgent, not speaking, just there. This is where myths go when they tire, not to end, just to lie down. And as you pass through the fading gold light, you begin to think about something no one ever asked. What if the real tragedy wasn't the transformation? What if it was the overreaction? Because that's the quiet truth under so many myths, the misstep, the misunderstanding, the escalation. Someone panics, someone punishes, and suddenly a life becomes a legend. Io didn't ask for divinity. She didn't want feathers or shrines or metaphors. She just wanted to be left in peace. And Hera, she didn't want a peacock. She wanted fidelity. What she got was a legacy built on rage, disguised as ritual. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Greek tragedies often center not on villains, but on choices. Small, often justified decisions that spiral into irreversible consequences. Hera turning Io into a cow wasn't an act of evil. It was a response. A wound externalized. That's why ancient audiences found such stories so cathartic. They weren't about power, they were about recognizing ourselves magnified. And your quirky tidbit? A fragment from a lost comedic play by Aristophanes refers to Hera as Queen of Feathers and Regret. The line is delivered by a talking goose disguised as a philosopher. No context, no explanation. But it implies that even then the story had already begun to collapse into commentary. Historians still argue whether Greek audiences sympathized more with Io or with Hera. But in the oldest versions of the myth, Io doesn't curse Hera. She doesn't even cry out, she just keeps going. That's the part we overlook. Not the transformation, not the vengeance, but the after. Io walks, not because she wants to be remembered, but because walking is the only thing left that still belongs to her. You reach the edge of a cliff, below the sea. It stretches out, wide, grey-blue, indifferent, and across it lands that have never heard her name. She once crossed this sea as a cow, as a whisper, as the spark of a shrine someone would one day mistake for a weathered milestone. She walked because she had no choice. Now, others walk because they choose to. And isn't that the strange, holy inversion? The myth began with overreaction, but it survives through quiet endurance. A bird no one trusted becomes a symbol of resurrection. A girl no one protected becomes a patron of those who walk unknown. The tragedy fades, the walking remains. You sit at the edge of the cliff until the stars begin to blink awake. You
think of Io, not as a cow, not as a goddess, but as someone who once stood very close to where you are now, looked out over the sea and whispered, "I will not be erased." And she wasn't. Not by Hera, not by time, not even by silence. You're somewhere inland now, past the shrines, the coastlines, the mosaics. The earth is redder here. The hills roll slower. The stars come out early, and the sky feels closer, like it wants to be part of the conversation. You're walking through a field of low stone fences and bleating sheep, and you're thinking, as one does when the air smells like time and sleep, about symbols. Because after all these miles, these myths, these feathers, these names that don't quite stay, you start to wonder, why animals? Why cows, birds, snakes, swans? Why does every ancient tale end with someone becoming something that grazes or squawks? And more importantly, what were they trying to say? You find a shepherd sitting beside a fire, quietly threading wool.
His dog snores nearby, tail twitching through some dream about goats with attitude. He glances up as you approach and says, "You looking for her?" You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. "They always are." You sit. The flames crackle. Someone's left figs and cheese on a stone slab. You're invited without words. The shepherd speaks again, softly. Funny how many stories end with someone getting turned into an animal. No one ever turns into a scroll or a chair. It's always wings or hooves or feathers. You ask him why, he smiles. Because animals don't explain. They just are. You sit with that. He pokes the fire. "Makes you wonder," he adds, "if being watched by 100 eyes hurts more than just being left alone." And there it is, the truth in the sheep smoke. The thing the myths almost said out loud but always blinked away from. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greek literature is filled with transformations, known as metamorphoses, often as punishment, occasionally as protection. Ovid's Metamorphoses catalogued hundreds. Some scholars argue these weren't just plot devices, but reflections of how identity was viewed as fluid, mortal, divine, human, beast, victim, victor. You were always a step away from becoming something else. And your quirky tidbit? In one lesser-known version of the myth, Io, after being restored, asks never to be fully human again. She begs the gods to let her keep a sliver of her other self. "Just enough," she says, "to still know the earth with my feet." No one records the answer. But that version ends with her walking, always walking barefoot. Historians still argue whether these animal transformations were cautionary, poetic, or spiritual. But the shepherd, he has his own theory. "People look at animals and see what they want to see," he says. "Loyalty, grace, stupidity, majesty, guilt." You put it there, and the animal just keeps walking, doesn't argue, doesn't correct you. He ties off the thread, sets the spool down gently. "That's why she lasted, you know. Io, she didn't push back. She let them say what they needed. Then she left." You thank him. He nods once, then curls under his blanket and vanishes into sleep. You walk again, alone now past dry olive trees and crickets, reciting tiny epics in the grass, and you realize the point was never the animal. It was the silence, the watching, the refusal to be reduced. Io didn't become a cow because she deserved punishment. She became a cow because someone else needed her to be something less articulate, less complex, easier to control. And the peacock? That's just what happens when someone tries to make art out of shame. You climb a small ridge. At the top, a low stone wall, half collapsed. A child has etched a cow into one of the remaining bricks. Beneath it, a row of triangles that look suspiciously like feathers. There's no inscription, just a pebble placed deliberately on top. You leave one beside it and walk on. The sky is deep indigo now. You're climbing a gentle hill, your feet crunching over dry moss and starlight. Behind you, everything. Shrines and feathers and silence and stone. Ahead, something you've sensed was coming, even if you didn't know the shape of it. You reach the top. There's no temple here, no statue, just the sky. And set into it, tilted slightly off from the familiar constellations, is a pattern that doesn't appear in any formal star chart. But you see it, a curve, a horn, a tail, a cow walking among the stars. You've found her final transformation. The ancient Greeks called it Io the star, though most forgot that long ago. Today, astronomers know the name Io as one of Jupiter's moons, volcanic, restless, circling the planet like a myth refusing to let go. But before that, she was placed in the sky, not to be glorified, to be remembered. Here's your mainstream historical fact. According to later Hellenistic versions of the myth, Io's wanderings ended not in obscurity, but in elevation. Zeus, to make amends, or perhaps just to clean up the narrative, lifted her into the heavens. Some sources claim she became part of the constellation Boötes. Others say she wandered into Taurus. The stories don't agree on coordinates, but they agree on motive, distance, dignity, light, and your quirky tidbit. On one ancient Etruscan funerary urn, a cow is shown leaping over a crescent moon. Scholars puzzled over it until one noticed the engraved word nearby, Io. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others insisted it was evidence that someone, long ago, believed Io made it home, not to Egypt or Olympus, but to the stars themselves. Historians still argue whether this elevation was earned, symbolic, or simply a mythic metaphor for closure. But here, under this night sky, it feels like the only possible ending. You sit on a low stone. Above, the stars shimmer, not bright, but intentional, not watching, just present. And there, just above the horizon, a thin streak of light arcs across the sky. A falling star, or maybe a hoofprint. You imagine Hera somewhere far away glancing up. No longer angry, just thoughtful. You imagine the peacock roosting in a garden, its eyes finally closed. You imagine the clay cows still gathering dust on altars no one visits, waiting patiently for someone to walk past and ask, "Who was she again?" And now you know what to say. She was the one who kept going, not because she had power, but because she refused to stop moving. She was punished, she was pitied, she was painted and praised and used and forgotten. But still she moved, across land, across ocean, across generations, until someone, maybe a god, maybe a poet, looked up at the night and said, "Let her walk where no one can ever touch her again." And there she is, still walking, across the dark, across the ages, across your memory, not as a cow, not as a queen, not even as a myth, just as a woman who, once turned into something else, quietly became more. You're walking in the present now, pavement underfoot, streetlights buzzing faintly above. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks twice, then settles. The world feels familiar again, but quieter somehow, as if something ancient followed you home. You pass a bookstore, closed of course. But in the window, nestled between new releases and forgotten paperbacks, is a slim volume titled Women Who Walked, no subtitle, no author, just an embossed cover with the faint outline of a cow's face, and, curled at the bottom, a peacock feather. You press your hand to the glass, then keep walking. You round a corner and find a mural, bright paint, modern lines, the kind of thing that appeared one night and no one questioned. It's not signed, but it shows a woman in profile, long hair, blown back, one hand shielding her eyes from a burst of light. Around her, a ribbon of figures, birds, snakes, horns, stars, rivers, feathers, all connected. You recognize them all. And suddenly so much clicks into place. Ito's story isn't rare because it's unique, it's rare because it was preserved, but there are so many others, unwritten, unnamed, just like hers. Walked, endured, transformed, then folded into time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In recent decades, scholars have revisited female figures in mythology through feminist and cultural lenses, noting how many were defined by what was done to them, rather than what they chose. Io, once a passive victim, is being reread as a symbol of survival, reclamation, endurance. And your quirky tidbit? A modern poet once argued that the peacock's tail was the first instance of weaponized memory, not as a weapon against others, but as a defense mechanism for selfhood, a way of saying, "I see what happened, I remember, and I'm still beautiful." Historians still argue whether these reinterpretations are fair or merely projections of modern values. But here's the secret you've discovered. That's what mythology is. It's not a museum, it's a mirror. You reach a small park, late, empty. You sit on a bench, look up at the stars. There, just above the skyline, Jupiter glows faintly. And next to it, if you squint, maybe, just maybe, Io, you imagine her, not as a character, but as a presence. Someone who walked through betrayal, transformation, grief, motherhood, exile, and still kept her pace. You whisper, "You made it." And for the first time the silence feels warm, because now you carry her too, in your steps, in your noticing, in your refusal to let the story be flattened into one god's wrath or one woman's shame. You rise, brush off your jeans, and walk on, past the mural, past the bookstore, past the history, with the quiet knowledge that myths don't just live in stars and ruins and symbols. They live in people who remember, and tonight, that's you. And now, you're not walking anymore, you're resting, finally. In a quiet room where the only sounds are the soft ticking of a clock, the occasional breath from someone sleeping in the next apartment, and the distant echo of everything you've carried to get here. You made it. You followed her, Io, across continents and centuries, across feathers and floods and forgotten names, through temples and tilework and twilight fields, and she never once asked you to, but you came anyway, not for her, for you, because you too know what it is to be watched, to be misunderstood, to be reshaped by someone else's story and still keep walking. You've carried shame like a second skin. You've worn silence like armor. You've made metaphors of your grief and tucked your hope inside symbols that other people called strange. And yet, you're still here. That's what Io was trying to teach, without sermons, without speeches, just by moving forward. She was the myth of momentum, the goddess of not yet. And now, as the final notes of her story settle into stillness, you feel it. That hum behind the silence. The slow, invisible applause of the cosmos saying, yes, that was enough. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Myths are never really over. They're open systems, alive, evolving, waiting for the next storyteller to find them, polish them, or simply carry them forward in a different accent. And your quirky tidbit? In a small town in southern Italy, there's an annual spring festival where young girls walk barefoot across the fields carrying paper birds tied to sticks. When asked what the birds are, they shrug and say, the ones who never stop watching. No one remembers the original reason, but they still walk. Historians still argue whether that's a remnant of Io or just coincidence. But we know better now, don't we? We know that the peacock still watches, that the cow still walks, that the myth still breathes, and in your quiet, soft-lit room, you breathe with it. You've followed her path. You've felt her silence. You've honored her regret. You've seen how even the most sorrowful metamorphosis can end in flight. So now, close your eyes. You're not a god, not a bird, not a symbol. You're just someone who remembers, and that is holy. Let it go now. Let the feathers settle. Let the footsteps fade into the earth behind you. No more gods to please, no more punishments to outrun, no more stars to chase. Just the gentle truth that stories do not demand. They invite, and you've accepted that invitation with grace. Breathe in slowly. Let your lungs fill with soft air. Exhale like a whisper, meant only for the moon. You've done enough. The symbols can rest, the metaphors can sleep. Even the 100 eyes, once wide and blinking with vigilance, are closed now, not in shame, but in peace. Because not all watching is judgment. Sometimes it's remembrance. You're part of that now, part of the myth's echo, the quiet chorus that carries Io, not forward, but home. Let your hands unclench, let your shoulders fall. You've walked far tonight, but there's no more distance to cover. Only stillness, only comfort, only the quiet assurance that some stories, no matter how long they wander, will always find their way into the softest part of the night. let the fan hum, let the lights dim, and sleep like someone who was never turned into anything but themselves.